Before we start discussing what led to the implosion of traditional tonality and the concurrent explosion of new musical languages that marked the first decades of the 20th century, I'd like to introduce a concept that will make it much easier for us to contextualize the music of the 20th century. It is a concept rooted in the seeming oxymoronic reconciliation of cyclicality and linearity. Bear with me. Today, we take for granted the benefits of linearity, of progress. For example, today our drinking water, medical care, and sanitary conditions are qualitatively better than they were 100 years ago, which in turn were better than they were 100 years before that. We are taller, stronger, and on average, we live longer than we did 100 years ago. All of this is, I think, ironclad evidence of linear progress, of improvement, that in many identifiable ways, today is the best of all possible worlds, and that tomorrow will be better still. But this standard of linearity, of qualitative improvement, cannot be applied to the arts, of which I will specifically address Western music. Yes, musical style changes, but that is not a function of progress. Rather, it's because for the last 1,000 years since the invention of music notation, musical style in the Western world has been a mirror of the environment in which the music was created. Would any of us hazard to say that the music of Arnold Schoenberg's is better than, that it marks an improvement over the music of Wolfgang Mozart? No, not improved, and not better, but not worse either. Rather, Schoenberg's music employs a different musical vocabulary, a different syntax. Musical expression is not linear, it is cyclical. For example, the brain-addingly complex musical acrostics of post-World War II ultra-serialist music, which we'll explore in lectures 14 and 15, have their musical parallel with the isorhythmic music of the 14th century. The Gregorian chant-based religious ecstasies in the music of the Estonian-born composer Arvo Pärt, born 1935, have their parallels in the musical masses of the Renaissance. The extraordinary every note counts precision of Stravinsky's neotonal music of the 1920s and 1930s has its parallel in Johann Sebastian Bach's epical work, The Art of the Fugue, completed in the late 1740s. The admittedly over-the-top expressive content and unrestrained virtuosity of my own Piano Concerto No. 2 has its parallels in the great romantic piano concerti of the late 19th century, the concerti of Grieg, Tchaikovsky, and Brahms. Again, for the last 1,000 years, expression in Western music has been cyclical. The sorts of things composers express in their music keep cycling around and around. However, the way composers say it has changed. That's because the musical syntax, the pitch, rhythmic, melodic, harmonic, notational, and instrumental resources available to composers is linear in that it is cumulative. Composers living and working at the end of the 20th century were, by any quantitative standard, surrounded by a richer syntactical environment than ever before. Composers could draw on 1,000+ years of musical styles and a global musical repertoire in their effort to find their own compositional voices and to create their own musical languages. The great challenge for composers living and working in the 20th century, and here in the 21st century as well, was to find their voice by synthesizing something of the vast, cumulative syntax around them. Parsing blame. So, whose fault was 20th century music what with its constant search for what was new and different, for its obsession with originality, for its abandonment of tradition and its mania for self-expression? Might I suggest we blame it all on Beethoven? It's okay. He's dead. He can handle it. Besides, who else are we supposed to blame? Bach? Mozart? Brahms? Obama? Blaming is fun and handy. It allows us to focus our ire on a single and, in this case, defenseless victim. It relieves us of having to think too hard, of having to appreciate nuance, of having to look at things too closely. Whose fault was the musical babble that we blithely refer to as the music of the 20th century? Well, Beethoven is the perfect scapegoat. He was the first composer who, in both word and compositional deed, insisted that his muse be free of any limits other than those he imposed on himself. A composer who came to believe that musical expression must be, first and always, a mode of self-expression, and that as an artist, he was obligated to pursue originality at all costs. In his own words, to never stand still. In many ways, and for many reasons, Beethoven might rightfully be considered the first modern composer, the first composer to willingly alienate his essential audience in his ongoing search for personal self-expression and novelty. But, and hey, we all knew there was going to be a but for all his apparent modernity, Beethoven was, in fact, a man of his time. As a child of the Enlightenment, that great 18th century philosophical and social movement that put the individual person at the center of European society and not the clergy or the aristocracy, Beethoven took for granted his own inalienable right to follow his own path, to do his own thing. The revolutionary social and political environment that helped to shape Beethoven's young adulthood reinforced his innate predilection for change and innovation. The disruption and grandiosity and heroism of the Napoleonic age helped the adult Beethoven to find his own disruptive, grandiose, and heroic musical voice, a voice that allowed him to overcome, musically at least, the tragedy of his hearing loss. Beethoven, then, was a man and artist of his time. And blame him, though we might, for German Romanticism and the musical syntactical revolution of the 20th century that followed, he was but a cog in the wheel of change, a catalyst who accelerated but did not initiate the ongoing stylistic and expressive change that had long been operative in Western music. A man of his time, Beethoven came to the conclusion that the creation of music was, at its root, an act of self-expression. The next generation of composers, who were also people of their time, agreed pretty much entirely with Beethoven's premise, though not because Beethoven said so, but because it resonated with their own experiences and worldviews. The Romantic movement, which emerged in the 1820s, was an artistic, literary, musical movement that celebrated feeling and the so-called spark of divinity, the divine spark that presumably linked every human being to the next and all humanity to nature as being the highest truth. The Romantic movement placed the artist at the apogee of society. 19th century composers, artists, and poets assumed the status of prophets, divinely inspired mediums through which humankind and nature found their voices. Nowhere was this mystical, quasi-religious view of art and the artist felt more powerfully than in German-speaking and Scandinavian countries. German Romantic art, like 19th century German philosophy, drew its inspiration from the deepest regions of the human psyche, from myth and folklore, from the most extreme emotions and experiences, and from the supernatural. France. According to the musicologist Arthur Locke. Quote, German tendencies, both in music and literature, strongly affected the course of the Romantic movement in France, unquote. Thank you, Professor Locke. I needed someone else to say that, because for your average Francophile, it is heresy to even imply that during the 19th century, the French turned to German models for anything. But it is true that for the first 70 years of the 19th century, many French composers looked to Germany for inspiration. For example, the great French Romantic composer Hector Berlioz bemoaned the state of music and opera in France and Italy and looked to Germany for inspiration. And it's no overstatement to say that in the 1850s and 1860s, young French composers were as addicted to the music dramas of Richard Wagner as they were to claret, cigarettes, and to arguing with one another. But that all changed in 1870, a year that would haunt Europe well into the 20th century. Yes, in 1870, the 20th century was still 30 years away. In fact, it was still 31 years away, as no century begins in year zero, but rather in year one. But let's not quibble about that now. 1870 was the year that began the issue and conflict that would roil Western Europe for the next 75 years. The issue was the unification of Germany, and the conflict was the Franco-Prussian War between France and Germany. The unification of Germany. What today is called Germany is an area of roughly 138,000 square miles, smack dab in the middle of Europe, an area occupied for millennia by German-speaking peoples. Since the days of ancient Rome, it had been understood that the best way to deal with these German-speaking peoples, tough, irascible, and lacking the humor gene as they seemed at the time to be, was to divide and conquer. It was understood that a united Germania in the center of Europe could spell nothing but trouble for the territories arrayed around it. Understanding this did not, in the end, help the Western Roman Empire, which was overrun and ultimately destroyed by various German tribes, including the Eastern Goths, or Ostrogoths, the Western Goths, the Visigoths, and the Vandals, whose name will forever be associated with wanton destruction and the fans of the Oakland Raiders. Between 962 and 1806, most of what today is called Germany was known as the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire, which was also known as the Holy German Empire, was, as the old line went, neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. Rather, it was an amalgam of, depending upon how you count them, between 300 and 500 states of various sizes, some ruled by princes, others by the church, and still others by their merchant class. The fragmentary nature of the Holy Roman Empire served its neighbors perfectly, and those neighbors, including France and the Russian Empire, did everything in their power to keep Germania as fragmented as possible. Oh, the best laid plans. What no one counted on was the French Revolution and the emergence a few years later of our little Corsican friend, Napoleon Bonaparte, who wiped the Holy Roman Empire off the map on August 6, 1806. In its place was created what was called the Confederation of the Rhine, a French satellite that included much of what today is Germany. Other German states, most notably Bavaria and Prussia, Prussia being the largest and most powerful of them all, became semi-autonomous kingdoms allied to France. Napoleon destabilized Europe entirely, and nowhere more so than in German-speaking lands. His wars released a latent German nationalism that could not be put back into the bottle, and his defeat left the state of Prussia, known as an army in search of a country, as the preeminent power in Central Europe. The indispensable man in Germany's unification was the Prussian statesman Otto von Bismarck, who lived from 1815 to 1898. Bismarck, a master and visionary politician, was appointed Prime Minister of Prussia in 1862. Having established Prussia as the leading German state, Bismarck, who understood entirely the advantages and obstacles to creating a unified German nation, began to engineer alliances between the various German states. What Bismarck required to anneal the German states into a single nation unified behind Prussia was a war that could unify the German states in a struggle against a non-German enemy. It was the French who provided the opportunity, and Bismarck got his war. The Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871. If any single historical event can be said to have precipitated World War I and the seemingly endless series of disasters that sprang from World War I, it was the Franco-Prussian or Franco-German War of 1870 and 1871. The immediate cause of the war was a dispute between France and Prussia as to who should assume the Spanish throne following the deposition of Queen Isabella II in 1868. This issue of Spanish succession was but a pretext. Bismarck used the tension between France and Prussia to bait the French into war. The French Emperor Napoleon III, 1808 to 1873, nephew of you-know-who, had imperial designs on the Rhineland, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and perceived the ever-expanding size and power of Prussia to be a direct threat to his ambitions. Thinking he was his uncle reincarnate, Napoleon III decided to put the Prussians in their place at his first opportunity. Bismarck played the French like a drum, and France declared war on Prussia on July 19, 1870. The French were not just beaten, they were humiliated. First, they were whooped at Wissembourg on August 4th, then at Spicheren on August 5th, then at Worth on August 6th, Mars-la-Tour, August 16th, Gravelotte, August 18th, all of which culminated in the Battle of Sedan, September 1st and 2nd, which ended when Emperor Napoleon III himself surrendered and was taken prisoner along with 104,000 of his men. The Allied German armies marched on Paris, which was put under siege on September 19, 1870. Having consumed as much dog au vin, catatouille, and pigeon bourguignon as they could stomach, the starving Parisians surrendered their city on January 28, 1871. Meanwhile, 10 days before the surrender, on January 18, 1871, a united German empire was proclaimed at the Palace of Versailles, the location chosen to rub fleur de sel into France's open wound. On February 17, 1871, the victorious Germans marched through Paris. France agreed to pay a 5 billion franc war indemnity to Germany and ceded most of the eastern French states of Alsace and Lorraine to Germany, areas that would not be returned to France until 1919. A brief but brutal uprising occurred in Paris between March and May of 1871, the so-called Paris Commune. When the smoke finally cleared, tens of thousands more French were dead, and the French Third Republic was declared. The Third Republic remained in power until July 10, 1940, when it was disbanded by the Nazis following their invasion and defeat of France. Germany and post-war French public opinion. The hostility the French, and particularly the Parisians, felt towards Germany and things German in the years after 1871 was epic. An immediate upshot of this was the founding in 1871 of the Société Nationale de Musique, the National Society of Music, by a group of young composers that included Camille Saint-Saëns, 1835 to 1921, Emmanuel Chabrier, 1841 to 1894, and Gabriel Fauré, 1845 to 1924. The avowed mission of the National Society was to bring an end to the pervasive influence on French music of German music in general and Wagner in particular. In order to achieve this, the National Society vowed to cultivate a distinctly French musical art. Their inspiration, like that of contemporary French visual artists, poets, and writers, was to be the French language itself. It has been said that Italy gave us the Renaissance and France just about everything else. It's a statement that Giuseppe Verdi, an arch-Italian nationalist, would have agreed with. Verdi was no great friend of the French, despite having lived in Paris for a number of years, or perhaps it was because he lived in Paris for a number of years, where he made a lot of money writing operas for Parisian audiences. Whatever his misgivings towards the French, he watched with horror the war between France and Prussia in 1870. After the French defeat at Sedan on September 2nd, 1870, a clearly distraught Giuseppe Verdi wrote this to his friend, the Countess Clarina Maffei, quote, "It is true that the blog, meaning the humbug, the nonsense, the impertinence, the presumption of the French was and is unbearable. But in truth, France has given liberty and civilization to the modern world. Let us not deceive ourselves. If she falls, our civilization will fall," unquote. France lost the war, but to Verdi and everyone else's relief, French culture did not fall. And essential to French culture is élan, stylishness, taste, poise, sophistication, panache, grace, finesse, all for its own sake. Along with the Enlightenment, among the many other gifts the French have given the world is a standard for cuisine, style, and design that have been considered the last word in taste, elegance, and chic for hundreds of years. But perhaps the single most beautiful thing France has given the world, with the exception of Paris and Catherine Deneuve, is the French language itself, a breathtakingly fluid and flexible amalgam of vowel and diphthong, ever so gently articulated by the most delicate of consonants. It is a language as silken, as languorous, and as highly nuanced as a 1961 Chateau Margaux, a language that lies at the very heart of what it is to be French. It is a language that stands in complete opposition to German, with its brief bordering on invisible vowels and its explosive, guttural, say it, don't spray it consonants. This issue of language is of great importance because as a result of the Franco-Prussian War, many late 19th century French composers rejected German-Austrian compositional models and techniques in favor of creating a uniquely French sort of music, one based on the blended vowels, the color, and the characteristic nuance of the French language itself. This French musical renaissance, triggered by the Franco-Prussian War, was brought to its culmination by the German despising, Parisian born and bred in always fascinating and marvelously disreputable Achille Claude Debussy, whose revolutionary new music created an entirely new musical syntax. Claude Debussy, 1862 to 1918, syntactical explosion and tonal implosion. In 1910, the 48-year-old Debussy laid out his modernistic bona fides in no uncertain terms when he wrote, quote, "The century of the aeroplane deserves its own music. As there are no precedents, I must create anew," unquote. As that quote reveals, Debussy was not only aware of the technological, intellectual, and philosophical spirit of the new 20th century, but that as an artist, it was imperative that his music reflect something of the new century. In a word, it was imperative that he be relevant. Debussy was born in the Parisian suburb of Saint-Germain-en-Laye on August 22, 1862. A lifelong resident of Paris, he died there on March 25, 1918 from colorectal cancer, having survived one of the first colostomy operations ever performed some 2 years before. Despite the hauteur Debussy would affect throughout his life, he came from an extremely modest background. At the time of his birth, his father was managing a china shop and his mother was working as a seamstress. The Franco-Prussian War affected the 8-year-old Debussy and his family personally, as his father was imprisoned for a period in 1871 for alleged revolutionary activities in association with the Paris Commune. By 1871, Debussy's extraordinary talent as a pianist had long been apparent, and in 1872, at the age of 10, he entered the Paris Conservatory as a student of piano and composition. Debussy was one of those students that drive teachers to distraction. Devastatingly witty, borderline disrespectful, artistically audacious, smugly arrogant, and obviously a genius. From the beginning of his compositional career, he was drawn to strange harmonies and harmonic progressions for the sheer sensuality of their sound. A very French language-inspired love of coloristic nuance for its own sake. One of Debussy's teachers was a pedant named Émile Durand. Debussy's fellow student, Antoine Ban, describes a typical lesson, quote, "At the end of the lesson, when Durand had examined all our exercises with scrupulous care, he would linger over the correction of young Claude's work with almost Epicurean enjoyment. Severe criticisms and angry pencil marks rained upon the pupil's head and music paper. However, as soon as the teacher's natural prejudice was overcome, he would reread in silent concentration the pages he had so cruelly mutilated, murmuring with an enigmatic smile, 'Of course, it is all utterly unorthodox, but still, it is very ingenious,' unquote." According to Debussy's biographer, Léon Vallas, it was in just this way that the master was gradually tamed by his pupil. Debussy's love of color and nuance, which are so intrinsic to the French language and the French cultural and intellectual soul, seems to have been hardwired into him. A wonderful story about Debussy's Gallic love of nuance is told by Alma Mahler, the wife of the composer and conductor Gustav Mahler. In April of 1910, the Mahlers journeyed to Paris for a performance of Gustav's Symphony No. 2. Alma's impressions and recollections of Debussy are priceless. Quote, "While the rehearsals were on, the composer and organist Gabriel Pernier gave a party in Mahler's honor and invited Debussy, Paul Dukas, Gabriel Fauré, and the Clemenceaus. For our information, Paul Dukas composed The Sorcerer's Apprentice, and Georges Clemenceau served as Prime Minister of France twice, from 1906 to 1909, and then again from 1917 to 1920. Back to Alma Mahler's reminiscence. Debussy's strong personality and the beauty of his head were very impressive. Yeah, Debussy had a double forehead. He brought his second wife, who was said to be very wealthy. He sat next to me at dinner, and I noticed that he only took the minutest helping of any dish. When Madame Pernier tried pressing him to eat more, his face took on a look of pain. But his abstemiousness had no ill effects. He was a broad-shouldered, ponderous man. Dukas, the composer of The Sorcerer's Apprentice, told me in an undertone that when they were schoolboys together and provided by their mothers with money to buy their mid-morning lunches, they all selected the largest confections except Debussy. He always chose the smallest and most expensive, for even as a child, he was nauseated by bulk. That evening, too, we were told that Debussy's ill treatment had almost been the death of his first wife. It was a youthful marriage on both sides, and they were very poor. She couldn't endure her life with him or life without him, so she took poison. He went up to her very calmly and took what money she had on her before sending for a doctor. She heard and saw it all, for she was not unconscious, but temporarily paralyzed. She recovered from the poison and was cured as well of her love for Debussy, from whom she was divorced." Unquote. Debussy remained at the Paris Conservatory for 12 years, until 1884, when at the age of 22, he won the Prix de Rome for his cantata, The Prodigal Son. It's a striking piece, cast in 9 movements and composed for soprano, tenor, and baritone voices and orchestra. Based on the biblical story of the prodigal son, Debussy had to compose it in just 3 weeks, as per the rules of the Prix de Rome competition. More than 20 years later, at his publisher's request, Debussy returned to it between 1906 and 1908. He replaced the 4th and 5th movements with newly composed music and did some polishing. Nevertheless, the bulk of the score remained as he had composed it at the age of 22, and as such, it reveals Debussy's voice as it existed at the beginning of his career. We hear in the prelude, for example, a degree of exoticism that betrays the influence of Russian music, particularly that of Modest Mussorgsky. In Debussy's vocal writing, we hear strongly the influence of the operas of his teacher, Jules Massenet. But more than anything else, in terms of Debussy's use of leitmotif, his harmonic language and dramatic writing, we are aware of the influence of Richard Wagner, an influence Debussy would reject soon enough. A URL to a recording featuring the amazing voices of Jesse Norman, Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, and Jose Carreras has been provided. Having won the Prix de Rome at the age of 22, Debussy was expected to actually go to Rome. Poor Debussy, having won a prize that everyone else coveted, he complained bitterly about having to leave his beloved Paris for what he considered a foreign exile in Rome, something for which not one of us feels sorry for him. Debussy remembered his pique at having won the prize this way, quote, "You've won the prize," someone said, tapping me on the shoulder. Whether you believe it or not, I can nonetheless assert that all my joy collapsed. I saw clearly the boredoms, the irritations that such a prize brings, unquote. Between 1885 and 1887, Debussy did indeed reside in the Villa Medici in Rome, and he confessed to having hated every minute of it. He detested his fellow artists, musicians, painters, and sculptors, who he found to be vulgar, uncultured, and wholly uninteresting. As for Rome itself, well, Debussy found it abominable. During his stay in the Eternal City, Debussy was required to send the authorities in Paris one composition a year so that they might keep abreast of his progress. The first piece he submitted, part of a work entitled Zuliema, elicited this response from the professors back home, quote, "At present, Monsieur Debussy seems to be afflicted with a desire to write music that is bizarre, incomprehensible, and impossible to execute," unquote. Much as I'd love to offer up a URL to a performance of Debussy's Zuliema, I cannot. The piece has never been recorded. That's because the piece no longer exists. Monsieur Debussy, deciding that, quote, "it calls Verdi and Meyerbeer to mind too much," unquote, destroyed it, as he did most of the music he wrote while in Rome. Another piece Debussy sent back to the authorities in Paris was a work for chorus and orchestra called Printemps, Spring, which they condemned as, quote, "this vague impressionism, which is extremely dangerous in works of art," unquote. For our information, this was the first time the term impressionism was used in connection with Debussy's music. If the pedants in Paris had taken their heads out of their derrieres and listened, they would have realized that Claude Debussy's impressionistic music was, in point of fact, at the very cutting edge of a new sort of French music, one that proudly embraced a thoroughly French language-inspired approach to sound, nuance, and color. In retrospect, it's clear that Debussy's loathing of things German was a product of the events of 1870 and 1871, as well as his own French chauvinism and his legendarily prickly personality. The only German composer he admired without restraint was Johann Sebastian Bach. On occasion, Debussy voiced respect for Beethoven's symphonies, but on the whole, he found Beethoven's music turgid and ungainly. Debussy once described an imaginary scene in which Beethoven, wandering down from heaven to a concert hall here on earth, had to sit through a performance of one of his own symphonies. I quote Debussy, "If Beethoven's unhappy spirit occasionally wanders into a concert hall, surely it returns hurriedly to the heavenly realm. His noble ancestor